And good evening and welcome back. It is Monday. It is time for the science fiction and writing stream. We are here. It is Monday evening. It's 8 o'clock and it's time it's time for me to waffle on about whatever I want to waffle on about. Really, that's what my whole purpose of this thing is. But it's nice to have you guys along as well. Anyway, it's lovely to... I've got no idea why you guys are around. I really don't, but there we go. Anyway, Nim Duskrin is here, Rogoff84 is here, Commander Terra Firma Glenn, good to see you, is here. Commander GR1988 is good to see you, Stalker 260 Sapphire, and J69713PB, hello. Man versus Pixels. Anyway, lovely to see you all, thank you very much for turning up. It's Monday and we're back, yes, so this is good, this is a good thing. How are we all? I just realised I'm wearing a green shirt. I keep forgetting this. But it's always not quite the right shade of green because it's not transparent. Is it even vaguely transparent? No, it's not even vaguely transparent. So it's obviously the right shade of green that doesn't work with the green that is the green screen. But it makes me look a little bit ethereal, which is probably quite a nice thing actually. I don't mind being slightly ethereal. One of these days I'm gonna get myself a shirt whereby it actually is a green screen. I'm just going to be ahead. And I'll be ahead of everybody. The void isn't clear. Yeah, so yes, all I need is, especially if I get a green hat and a green shirt. And maybe I could colour my hair green and slowly each week bits of me would disappear into the void. That would be quite good fun. Ah, dear. How are we doing? Are we good? Hello, Monday peeps. Kelly Baglow is here as well. Commander P. Frost is here as well. Excellent. Ridge W. And Jason66. Always good to see. Good to see regular usernames. Of course, I would know. Other than a few of you, I'm friends with on Twitter and Facebook, of course. And those of you who are on Facebook, I do occasionally get to see pictures of what you actually look like in real life, which is always very disconcerting because nobody looks how I imagine them to look. So I don't know if that's a thing, whether I just have a very, very bad imagination or possibly a very good imagination. I had Daddy Hoggy, who's sometimes on the stream, his avatar was for many, many years, because I think I met him online in like about the year 2006 or something stupid like that. And we never met in person until many years had passed. And I remember being intensely disappointed because his avatar was of a very large crow. And it was an immense disappointment to find out that he wasn't in fact a 6-foot crow in real life. So if only we could look like our avatars. I mean, my avatar is obviously me in a hat, so mine's not very imaginative, but so there we go. Now, the shirt is good. It looks mostly dark grey. Okay, yeah, I suppose it's gone grey. It's not being badly represented actually on the screen, surprisingly enough. And with the green hat, we have a floating pin. Yes, well, wouldn't that be awesome? Although my head would look most peculiar, I think, with most of it chopped off. And as I turn different angles, bits of me would disappear, wouldn't it? That would be that would be very wrong. Dear. Get some green. Yes, I could be the Invisible Man. I could paint myself. I wonder how well that would work. I could paint a little bullet hole, couldn't I? I'm going to have to find some blue, not blue, green paint. That's going to be fun. Get some green paint and draw holes in your face. Anyway, the long text here. I've just learned that exciting news that a friend I went to university with has just published his first fantasy novel. Oh wow, okay. It's called The Crimson Script by S.J. Hull. I think I'll have to check it out, but he's a really smart dude. And I remember having great chats with him about various fantasy topics back then. Wow, okay, well that's good. Do you know when it's coming out? The Crimson Script. Do you know what it's about? Even in small small detail. That'd be good. There would be a pin badge floating in space. One day Drew just vanished, and all that's left out there somewhere is a pin badge floating in space. Kelly Baglass says his books are best left to your imagination. Okay, I will bear that in mind. What's the next topic? Oh, we haven't got anywhere near that yet. Come on, luckily, Luigi, come on. You've been around here long enough to know that we can't be possibly anywhere close to the topic yet. Drew shook up. I aspire to be a disembodied life form. I always quite, those they're a bit of a staple of a sort of B-movie science fiction, aren't they? Because they're relatively easy special effects to make. At least they were in the 60s and 70s, where I suppose it was Star Trek really, where everybody you always encountered some sort of energy-based life form. And I don't know quite how an energy-based life form, how it works really, because it sort of floats through the cosmos being an energy field. I mean, it doesn't sound like a particularly exciting life, does it? And what do you do if you're an energy-based life form? 20 minutes of banter still remaining at least, says Talker260. Yes, it's probably the same thing. There is oh, I missed a joke. Invisible man's at the door. Tell him I can't see him. Oh, very good, Alan. Very good. So yeah, I'm sorry. Green screens. I don't know. There's something just magical about them because they appeal to the child in me, and whilst a lot of things do appeal to the child in me, and the child in me, to be honest, is a very large part of my persona because I'm, as you know, very. Very childish, a lot of the time. But yeah, green screens are just magic. Look, I can transport myself anywhere with a reasonable degree of clarity. Now, what I think I've mentioned before is I want to have in my future study when I'm rich and famous, and I think Scrub the Famous, we talked about that as well. Just rich, I want to have a bigger study. Okay, that's my aspiration. So I can stand in front of a green screen because I haven't quite got room to do that. Because if I go too far back, I hit the green screen. Which will sort of slightly destroy. Well, it will actually. Look, actually, no, you can't see that. The green screen is good enough that if I wobble it, it doesn't wobble the fabric of the universe, which is a bit of a shame. It's just I don't know. There's something about transporting myself into space, like I have done here, that just appeals to me, which is nice. There we go. Oh, it's already out. Okay, so this is the book. It's already out. Apparently, it came out last month, and I totally missed it. It must have been the algorithms. Those algorithms. Damn those algorithms. Must have been the... I won't summarise here. I won't be able to do it justice. His website has a blurb all about it. But okay, well, I'll check that out. sjhull.net. Awesome. Well, it's nice to see other people getting published. That's awesome. That's awesome. So, my looks are best left to your imagination. Kelly Baglow, you can't be that bad. Surely. It's as close as we can get to a holiday, but yeah, I suppose it is really. I must admit, I find what you can do with, obviously with the professional films and stuff with CGI and motion tracking and all that kind of good stuff. I mean, it must be. I'd find it very hard. Not that I can act at all, but I'd find it very hard to act. I think if there wasn't anything there most of the time, lean on this handrail over this incredible, glorious vista. When actually all there is a green piece of cloth and a camera pointing at you. I suppose that artists and actors have that sort of problem all the time, really. But how do you do that? That's very, very strange. But never mind. So green screens aside. So topics for tonight. We need to keep. I was quite interested, and as you know, I've been reading, and I think I've got with me. No, it must be in the other room. I've been reading The Lord of the Rings again, so I've kind of rekindled my inner fantasy geek. I've actually finished technically, I was a bit puzzled by this, and here's a question for you all: is in the intro of the book version of Lord of the Rings that I've got. Now, mine's quite an old version. I think mine dates from the late 70s, my copy of Lord of the Rings. It's in 3. Now, this is where it gets a bit crazy, because in the introduction that I've got, in the physical manifestation of Lord of the Rings, which is in 3 bits that I have, okay, and the reason for me prevaricating on this point will become clear, is that in the introduction, Tolkien himself says this is a novel of 6 books. And I'm like, a novel of 6 books? And it's like, I thought a novel was a book, or a book was a novel. I thought that I tend to personally use the words interchangeably, but Tolkien didn't. So what did he mean by, he claims it's a single novel in 6 books, actually, in 3 volumes. Which sounds needlessly complicated, if you ask me. But that's what he says. That's actually what he says in his introduction. It's one novel in 6 books in 3 volumes. So I'm assuming volumes is kind of the publishing constraint. So he had to publish a certain amount of stuff at a certain point in time to make the books large. So each volume contains 2 books. And it does say that as you're reading through it. It says book 1, book 2. And book 1 and book 2 form the Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first bit. Okay, then books 3 and 4 are the 2 towers, and books 6 and 7 are the Return of the King. And the volume is Fellowship of the Ring, 2 towers, and Return of the King. Each have composed 6 books, but none of those books have individual names. They are just 6 books. But the entire thing is called a novel. And I was like, okay. It really threw me, actually. I spent about a good 5 minutes sitting there pondering this, spooning strawberry bonbons into my mouth on Sunday afternoon, as you do. At least I do, anyway. Along that with a cup of tea. So I don't know. That one surprised me. Is there a definition of a novel? Stroke book, stroke. I mean, volume sort of makes sense, because a volume is a collection of things. But it's very novel. It's very novel indeed, yeah. But I've always thought of a novel as a book. But obviously Tolkien decided that was not the case. I don't know. But anyway, there we go. So yes, where have I got to? Well, anyway, last week we were discussing the merits or not of Tom Bombadil. And I went through that because we hadn't quite got to that section in the book. I read it through again this time round, and it is still, in my humble opinion, utterly pointless to the book, or the novel, or the volume. I hate to be the publisher that told an English professor. I know, actually, who am I? Actually, that's a very good point. I mean, he was an English professor. Who am I to be criticising Tolkien's definition of the word novel? But I don't know. It's a bit weird. Blue Ganymede to the Mr. Memo about strawberry bonbons. They are. See, I like. I mean, not that I had a deprived childhood, but okay, I was never allowed very many sweets when I was young. Okay, I had. I mean, those of you who grew up in the 70s will remember the tuck shop, which is probably something that needs to be translated for other cultures and countries. But if any of you do remember the tuck shop. Basically, in ye olden days at school, you had at break normally at the first break. Sorry, you've diverted me. I need to go down this one because it's nostalgia city. At the first break, which it must have been about 10:30 or something in the school day. Basically, they. Schools used to sell sweets, actual proper sugary sweets to the children in the morning break between. You'd get into school, you'd do the assembly where you had to sing some ridiculous hymns for a bit. Then you'd have a few lessons, and then you'd have break, and then you'd have some more lessons, and then you'd have lunch. Okay, now in the first break, because there was sometimes one in the afternoon as well. In the first break, you could buy sweets at school, which probably sounds horrific today. But in the 1970s, it was a staple part of going to school. It was called the tuck shop. I've got no idea what tuck actually comes from, but it was called the tuck shop. So anyway, of course I'd go along. But most of the time, I wouldn't have any money because my parents only gave me pocket money once a week. And I got 10p each week for most of the 70s, which wasn't a great deal of money. Even then, it wouldn't buy you anything now. And so it's only occasionally that I could go along to the tuck shop clutching my 10 pence to buy some sweets. So I do feel like I was deprived of sugar in my young age, and so I sort of occasionally make up for it now. And it's not been unknown for me to scoff an entire bag of strawberry bonbons as a result, which is exactly what I did on Sunday whilst reading Lord of the Rings. Which was jolly pleasant, I have to say. It's a good if you need a good way to spend an afternoon, a good book, a cup of tea or two, as we discussed last week, how to make a cup of tea, and some sweets, pure sugar, very, very bad for you. But I don't know. Actually, I mean, I don't know. I mean, 10p wasn't very much even back then. I do remember actually. Very, very vivid memory of about possibly 1981, 1982, when my parents, with great shock and horror, watched some BBC documentary on what the average pocket money was across the UK. It was actually, somebody did a semi-serious documentary on the BBC, and I happened to watch it, and apparently the average pocket money across the BBC for children at that age was 50p. And then, of course, I was watching this and I was like, oh, I'd kill if I had 50p a week. My dad said something sarcastic, but I think I got a raise to 20p a week, but I certainly didn't get to the giddy heights of 50. But there we go. So Glenn says actually, yes, even here in the US in high school we had a morning break, and it was you could get breakfast things usually junk and sugar or donuts. Yeah, bring back the olden days where we could eat junk food at school. I've started buying cream eggs again in 10. I says cream egg. I see cream eggs as a little bit. Johnny come lately in the snack department. I like the classic old school sweets, like aniseed twists and things like that. Stuff that you get. There are actually a few places in the UK you can get Ye Olde Sweet Shop, and I think there's a website called aquarterof.co.uk or something like that where you can buy sweets of yesteryear. I quite like those, but there we go. Glenn destroyed a package of Oreo cookies the other day while I was not really paying attention. That is definitely the best way to eat sugary things like that. There we go. No, I find I can eat one cream egg occasionally, but I quite like chocolate, but I'm not a massive fan of chocolate. My wife absolutely loves chocolate, whereas a bit of chocolate and then I'm happy for quite a long time. So fizzers, yes, there we are. Commander Hope Hubris is knocking it on the head here. Fizzers and Swizzers matter. They are the kings. They are the giants. The little double lollies. They were brilliant. When you just kind of rip them off with your teeth and your teeth stay in your head. And I quite like the other one, Palmer Violets. They're quite good as well. Really like those as well. There's one across the road for me, unfortunately closed at the moment. So you need to get that back. I'm looking forward to getting some proper sweets again. Sugary snacks and fantasy books. So anyway, so I'm reading Lord of the Rings again, as I mentioned. I got past Tom Bombadil stage. No, still don't see that it added anything. And it took the Hobbits. It takes the Hobbits an entire book just to get to Rivendell. Which is quite interesting to compare and contrast with The Hobbit, which is, of course, the previous book, where it takes Bilbo about a page and a half to get to Rivendell. It's quite a surprising difference in the amount of detail that Tolkien put in there. So I think that trip to that trip to Rivendell that Bilbo did in like 4 or 5 paragraphs. I'm going to do an entire book, which is exactly what he did. So. And then the interesting thing then, actually, the next book basically starts off 1/3. I measured this, about 1/3 of the book. What is book 2, i.e. the second half of Fellowship of the Ring, is basically Gandalf sitting in his chair at the Council of Elrond, telling everybody what's going on. It's pure exposition. It's the sort of thing today. The editors would go, nope, get the story moving, get that ring off down to Mordor, get moving, stop Gandalf talking. But, see, now this is the interesting thing, and we discussed this a little bit last week, is, a modern editorial take on Lord of the Rings would slaughter it. It really would slaughter it. And you'd have to cut all that exposition out, and basically Gandalf would be forced to tell that story in bits and pieces along the way, in order to keep the editorial pace of the book up. You just couldn't get away today with writing Lord of the Rings in its current form, because at no stage your character's allowed to sit in a chair, have a smoke, and then just tell stories for 20 pages. But you see, I don't know whether I'm a certain age. I quite like it actually. I got to that part of the book and thought, good, okay, right. No more panic and no more daring do and adventures, and those Black Riders have been dispatched. Now we can just have a chill. Okay, we're in Rivendell now. There's at least 30 pages here where I can just chill out with. I know no harm is going to come to anybody at all. Everybody's safe. We're just going to sit down, have a nice story from Gandalf. It was actually quite relaxing. But it's interesting, on a sort of serious writing perspective, to look at that and just say you wouldn't get away with it. I wouldn't write something like that anyway myself, because that's not my style of writing. But I don't think anybody could get away with doing that with a modern editor. I just don't think they're just go, what are you doing? Everyone's fallen asleep. Bring back Spangles. Spangle. What about Texan bars? Who remembers Texan bars? I'm going to chuck in random sweets today. Texan bars are one of my favourites. Cough candy, strawberry. What were the strawberry hard ones with the sherbet in the middle? Strawberry sherbets. Duh. Not sure which is longer, the Council of Elrond or the Entmoot. Now the Entmoot would drive me mad. You've just said good morning. And actually, exactly, Luigi, that's a very good point. Actually, is when they turn the Hobbit into. So I mean, Lord of the Rings. We've decided 1 novel, 3 volumes, 6 books turned into 3 films, which is kind of reasonable, isn't it? I mean, if you watch the director's cut version of the Lord of the Rings films, actually, which I would definitely recommend if you are going to watch them, because they make more sense. There's a lot of extra material in there, which actually does help the story along. They made some quite reasonable editorial choices, I think, when they made that film. The die-hard fans might be upset by some of the substitutions that they did. They got rid of Tom Bombadil, and that was an excellent thing that they did. But I'm not a big fan, as you could probably work out. But the structure there. I think they paid quite good homage to the things. Now, the bits are interesting. Having read Lord of the Rings again and I've just finished Fellowship of the Ring, actually, just so you know where I am in the story. The Fellowship has disbanded. They've been through Moria. Gandalf's dead. At least he's fallen into the darkness of Khazad-dûm. And the ring went south. They went through Moria and all that kind of good stuff. And obviously, one of the things that they really changed a lot, which I'd forgotten about, but I did remember, was that the whole thing with Arwen, Evenstar, was totally substituted for Gildor, I think it is, in the book. So it's like because I don't know whether this is that was just Tolkien's style, but there have been no female characters at all of any note in the book at all, really, other than the lady. What's her name in Lothlorien? What's her name? Forgotten her. Oops, forgotten her. She's very powerful. She's got an elven ring. What's her name? Anyway, get the no. Galadriel. There we go. Thank you very much. Let's talk about that. Dru is spoiling the whole story. Have you not seen Lord of the Rings? After 20, it's almost 20 years since those films came out. Yeah. So anyway, Galadriel. Okay, yeah. She's the only female character of note really so far, unless you count. What's the poor Hobbit lady who gets kicked out at the end? Sackville Baggins lady. And then there's Arwen, of course, in Rivendell, but she hasn't really done anything. Arwen sort of, she sits in the council. I don't think she's in the Council of Elrond. She sits in one of the banquets they have and just sort of glows. I think that's how she's sort of described, with crystals in her hair and stuff. And that's about what she's done. And then there's Lobella. There we are. Lobella Sackville Baggins is the only other female character that's been in the book so far, and she's just been stroppy and awkward and pinching spoons. And I haven't got to Eowyn yet in the Two Towers, because I'm just about to start the Two Towers next. That'll be next, the horse stalls and stuff. So it would be again. You probably Belladonna Tonks, yeah. But you probably couldn't get away with writing a story like that. No, where's the diversity? All that sort of question. You couldn't get away with that sort of thing now. So it's interesting to sort of. I mean, Lord of the Rings is 70 years old now. Belladonna is it Belladonna Took? Was there? I don't even remember her. That's how much attention I was paying there. So not many female characters thus far, it has to be said. Although Lady Galadriel was well done. So that was quite good. So interesting, just interesting observation on that sort of stuff. So there we go. Glorfindel. There we are. Glorfindel's the character substitute. I couldn't remember. It was Glor something. I get a bit confused with all the names because there are so many of them. I think if you're writing a fantasy novel and you need an appendices with all the names, this is the problem I got with Doomdark's Revenge. For those of you who follow my progress or slow progress, shall I say, on Doomdark's Revenge, is managing the number of characters. It's just, and some of them, but they're as bad as the elves in Lord of the Rings. They're very, very similar names, differentiating between lots of characters is hard. Tolkien loves to just chuck in. Belladonna Took only talked about. Okay, there we go. Yes. Is Belladonna Took his Frodo's? I can't remember. So here we go. Oh, thank you for following there. Something, and thank you for hosting. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Very nice. Hobbit and Snow White and Seven Dwarfs came out in the same year, 1930. Is that how old it is? 1937. Wow. So, and who can be said to wear Tolkien's? No, I wouldn't say George R.R. Martin was even remotely close to Tolkien's kind of vision of things. Some of the names in Tolkien's thing. I mean, if you look at there's a list somewhere of all the characters that appear in all of the books, including the Silmarillion stuff, and it's just an endless long list of them. And one of the things Tolkien does that does wind me up a bit is it's usually one of the elves. It's usually Elrond or Gandalf actually, who will basically go, of course, back in the elder days there was so and so son of so and so who bequeathed the blessing of the some things upon the things, and the land was rended, and then so and so of so and so did this, and so did that, and the times like that we shall never see again because of so and so. It's like, how many names have I got to remember here? Is this important to the plot, Tolkien? Can't we just get back to dealing with this ring? So there we go. I don't know. The reason I remember the name Glorfindel is because a character of the same name appears. Oh, does it? Okay. Is it the same character though, or is it somebody else? Because Glenn, the first time I read Lord of the Rings, I had to start writing characters in a short description. I know, and that's quite a lot of work, isn't it? Particularly if you're supposed to be reading this book for enjoyment's sake. Having to bring along a spreadsheet of names. It's like Glorfindel, isn't it? It's confusing. So have a manageable cast. Have a manageable list of cast members. Terry Pratchett is Tolkien's Crown in the Modern Age. I don't know. I must admit, I haven't. I know this is a bad admission. Really, I haven't read much modern fantasy. Certainly recently. I mean, I suppose what was the last pure fantasy book I read? I'm not sure. If you've got recommendations for something that's kind of well representative of the modern era in terms of fantasy, then I'd be quite interested in reading it. Robert Jordan's writing further Conan stories, Wheel of Time, yes, come across those. And J.K. Rowling got her ideas from J. Well, this is sort of brings us, actually, that's a good point there, Vision 880. This sort of brings us to my topic du jour. We're here at 8:30, we should say. Talking about it, and we've been talking a little bit of fantasy, let's be fair. Perhaps Brandon Sanderson. Okay, that was the pain with early ebooks. You click the appendix. Yeah, I know so ebooks don't lend themselves to flipping back and forth to a map or an appendices, do they? One of the things I like doing actually with Lord of the Rings as I'm reading it is having the map in front of me, the map of Middle Earth, and figuring out where things are going, and seeing the sort of choices that they're making about the landscape, because the maps do help with that. No distractions, says Kelly Baglar. Terry Pratchett or David? No, I've read Terry. Now Terry Pratchett. Okay, now I'm. It's everyone's going to abandon the stream in absolute outrage and horror. I quite like his stuff some of the time, but some of his books I just don't get. I do, things like The Colour of Magic and Guards, some of those ones, particularly the ones centred around Ankh-Morpork and all those sort of things, side-splittingly funny, but some of his other stuff I just didn't quite get. I don't know, maybe that's me being off kilter, but I rate Terry Pratchett on his day, but some of the time I find him a bit overrated. There, I've said it. It's a bit like the Beatles, Some people go, "Ooh, the Beatles." I don't. I've got maybe 4 or 5 of their songs I think are quite good, and the rest is I can live with the world without that, And some people look at me as if I'm a spawn of Satan, but even pretending to diss the Beatles. And Terry Pratchett is sort of, here we go, heresies. So I can appreciate him. I think he's quite good on his day, but I don't think he's necessarily astonishingly, amazingly impressive all the time. Terry's characters, to be fair, his characters are very memorable. I can still remember a lot of them, even now, and even though I can't necessarily remember the stories. I haven't read anything of Sanderson's, no. So David Eddings, that's the man. I want to say the Mandalorian, but that's not right. So David Eddings is the what's the name of his series? The Belgariad, something like that. Small Gods is one of the best books ever. Yeah, so Small Gods was Belgariad. There we go. It was the Belgariad. I couldn't remember the name, but that's another one. The Mandalorian. That's right. I wanted to say Mandalorian. I was going, why is my head going Mandalorian? It was Mandalorian. That's right. It's not that. I have spoken. Best written thing I've come across for quite a long time, actually, The Mandalorian. I thought that was very, very good. I must admit, his last few books. Yeah, so I'd read some of his early stuff. I mean, if you read some of his really early stuff, and The Colour of Magic, I think, is one of his early books, Terry Pratchett. And maybe it's just not as good as the later ones. Maybe he wasn't quite in his stride at that point. The Mandalorian is the sequel to... Now, I've read the Belgariad. Now, I think the problem, again, I had was rather like... I think the other chap we discussed last week, what was it? Terry Brooks, with the XYZ of Shannara. I think this is probably the nastiest way to refer to his series. Is they were very kind of derivative of Tolkien's environment, and I think that to me has always been a problem, and that sort of brings me on to my sci-fi topic, as my fantasy topic tonight, which is kind of the tropes of fantasy seems so ingrained, perhaps compared to more the flexibility that you have in in science fiction, because Tolkien's sort of contribution, which is immeasurable, and I absolutely adore The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, as books, always have. I read The Hobbit at age 8, 9, and was utterly captivated. It was the first book I remember reading where I went, wow, what, this guy invented this entire world, and it's got magic and dragons and orcs and goblins and swords and all sorts. And it totally blew me away. And I've loved reading, actually thinking about it, ever since I read The Hobbit. The Hobbit was the book for me that really went, wow, you can actually paint a real fantasy world, and it just all kind of makes sense. And it was just the most brilliant experience I've ever had, reading a book. It was the book that brought reading alive for me. So I owe Tolkien a great debt there. I can't diss him very much. And he will always be my favourite fantasy author, because he just is. It's just inevitable. And then I finished The Hobbit, because obviously The Hobbit isn't very long. I finished it fairly quickly and asked, did this guy write anything else? Is there book 2 of The Hobbit? And I remember my dad saying, you need to read Lord of the Rings, but it'll take you a bit of time. So, I think it must have been a few years later. I think he said, you need to be a bit older to read it, because it's a bit more grown up. But I got a copy of Lord of the Rings, I think for my 11th birthday or something. I remember this enormous book. Sadly, I haven't got that copy anymore, because I think I destroyed it. But I remember this enormous book. And I remember thinking, wow. And then started reading it, and it was much, much, much tougher as an 11-year-old than The Hobbit was. It wasn't, it could have been written by a different author as far as I'm concerned. But it took a while to get into it. But I got there at the end, and it was still good. Anyway, Lucky Luigi, the Colour of Magic and the Light Fantastic were great, but he was still finding his stride. I think you're right, he improved dramatically, didn't he? So maybe his middle stuff is where Terry Pratchett was best. So Hope Hubris, I think you're right, is maybe authors take a bit of time to get up to speed. I think that's not unreasonable, is it? JL, I think my favourite Terry Brooks. So yeah, actually Terry Brooks, now there's the Sword of Shannara, the Elfstones of Shannara, the something else of Shannara. There's quite a lot of thing of Shannara. And they're certainly passable, but they feel very derivative. They feel very derivative to me. It's the same sort of things. You could almost transfer quite a lot of the characters straight across from Lord of the Rings, and it would almost be in some ways the same, just not as good, really. But fun to read, but not as good. But the Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold, and I think there's a sequel to that, which I can't remember. There were 2 or 3 books in that series. That was actually better, I thought, because it was actually more imaginative. And if you I haven't read those for a long time. They were out of print last time I checked. I couldn't get a copy of them. But there we go. Wish Song of Shannara. That's right. It's always another thing of Shannara. But Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold was a totally different type of story. Basically, there's this. I think he's a millionaire or something, isn't he? Who sees an advert for a Magic Kingdom advertised in the newspaper and goes, "Well, that sounds like something worth spending some money on." And he's recently lost his wife or something. There's a small amount of tragedy and a lot of money involved, and he basically buys this Magic Kingdom, assuming it's just going to be some sort of scam, and it turns out to be an actual magical kingdom, which he has to look after, which is actually quite fun. And it's a sort of light-hearted fantasy novel, but with lots of the sort of standard fantasy kind of, you've got to be the hero and you've got to rescue the princess and save the castle from being destroyed and all those kind of things, but in a kind of really confined sort of space. Which is rather good. So actually, the Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold is a great series of books. I thought that was quite imaginative. David is now the Belgariad. I didn't read it as a young man. I only read that when I was quite a bit older, and I think I needed to read it earlier to appreciate it, because it sits uneasily in my memory as not as good as Tolkien. I think this is one of the big problems that with fantasy is Tolkien made such a massive impact. It's like a cataclysmic crater on the moon, where no matter how big a crater you try and make, you're never going to be as big as the cataclysmic Tolkien crater. And I think it's really tough with fantasy to come up with something that isn't obviously Tolkien derived. And the big problem with that, and and things like Dungeons and Dragons haven't necessarily helped, because they're very, very much associated with the fantasy genre in terms of role-playing games and those sort of things, is that the problem that you have with the fantasy is if you stick to the standard sort of tropes that you have. Eddings wrote Belgariad because he didn't like Tolkien. Okay, that's interesting. And so as I remember, Belgariad opens with a big long description of different types of gods and all sorts of things. Okay, there's other suggestions here. Lucky Luigi, Coldfire Trilogy by Celia S. Friedman. I haven't read that. I might have to add that to my list. I do have to go back through these streams and take note of what people are recommending. David Gemmell's book, I've read that one. That one's good. Douglas Adams, of course. Yes, is that fantasy? I suppose it is sort of. It's sort of comic, sort of sci-fi fantasy. I tend to think of Douglas Adams as science fiction, even though there's not a great deal of science in it. But Tolkien's influence. Now, the problem that I think I have with fantasy novels is there's 2 bits. If you're going to go for sort of epic high fantasy, you're almost forced into having the same sort of setup as Tolkien did. So you've kind of got this slightly peculiar medieval Europe fantasy setting where everybody wanders around with swords and armor and stuff like that. There's obviously some level of magic. Okay, you can up and down your level of magic depending on what kind of story you've been telling, but you also have elves and dwarves and goblins or orcs, and human beings. And the elves always tend to be kind of, ooh, it's lovely living in the forest singing songs. And the orcs always tend to be, we are just mean and horrible and we don't take baths. And the dwarfs are always, look at me and my axe because we like eating red meat. And the men are kind of, well, we're not anything of the other types of men, but we like having wars. Let's have some more wars, you know. It's like, it's really difficult to get away from that. Really, really hard to get away from that kind of, and it doesn't. In some ways, it doesn't. I mean, the races are an interesting thing. Yeah, elves are elves, dwarves are dwarves, goblins are goblins, and men are men. You know, so that's that's tricky to kind of get away from. And then you've also got this slightly odd medieval background, which I always find a bit curious, particularly when I read the Lord of the Rings. When you get to Elrond in particular, he's basically saying, "Well, you know, I was there, Gandalf. I was there 2,000 years ago at the battle of whatever it is where they defeated Sauron the first time." And you kind of think, "What? You were there 2,000 years ago, and you've made no progress in the intervening time. You've had 2,000 years to make a better sword, or some better equipment." And what have you been doing all that time? You know, society hasn't progressed at all, and it just seems being a very, very curious thing that fantasy novels, that society never changes at all. For any, it's like, are there any inventors? Isn't there anybody who's trying to improve things? Everyone's entirely satisfied with just wandering around, not having hot showers, etc., etc. All those sort of things. And nobody's thought, hang on a minute, these wheels, we can make better versions of them. Or this fire, because they've got some basic levels of technology. They just never seem to improve on them. So those sort of things are a bit strange, I find. My favourite as a child was a weird stone of Brissingaman. Don't know that one either. Wow. Okay. Waving the flag for Raymond E. Fife. Yes, that's quite good. Yes. Battle of Daggerland. That's right, Chris. Well done. Shadow Brooks, Shadow of the Conqueror. Haven't tried that. No. Elves live a long time. Yeah. The Elves in the Dragon Age series of games are oppressed race forced to live in elven games. So yeah, so you can do, and that's quite an interesting thing. I think some people have tried to do different takes on the races that are sort of almost required in a fantasy series. I think about it, how much technology changed between 2000 BC and 500 AD. I mean, you can make that point. I agree. That sometimes the pace of change isn't very fast, and sometimes it doesn't go on. And how can you improve a bow and arrow? No, I mean, that's a good point as well. But there is some evidence, even in Tolkien's books, of technologies that are a bit more advanced. I mean, Saruman blows up Orthanc, doesn't it? Not Orthanc. Helm's Deep with some at least appears to be gunpowder. I suppose you could claim it was magic, but it appears to be gunpowder. So somebody's got a working knowledge of gunpowder, some of the ballista and catapult type weapons that they field in the Battle of the Plenna Fields are obviously a little bit more advanced. If you can, and also the construction techniques used to build Minas Tirith are pretty impressive. So where did that technology go? That was a sort of downfall of the race of Numenor and all those sort of things. There's lots of unanswered questions about the way that society has gone. So things like that, are quite good. Someone's clipped my orca version. And they were still using horses in World War II 100 years ago. I suppose that's true. It didn't go all that well for the horses, as I recall. But so maybe, and I think I've talked about that in our science fiction stream previously. Is that maybe our or maybe my, in this case, obsession with technology change is perhaps a modern disease, and we should get much more used to a slower paced life where things don't change so much. But fantasy novels do seem to exist in an environment where there's virtually no change at all. Certainly on the life the lifespan of men and hobbits and dwarfs, perhaps. Well, maybe not elves, because they can live for 2,000 years, or whatever it happens to be. So I don't know. That one always strikes me. But it's really quite difficult to get away from those races. The other problem you have with fantasy novels, certainly the ones, Tolkien derivative ones, is the sort of standard quest problem. It's where you have and this is a common theme with science fiction as well. The sort of chosen one syndrome is somebody somewhere uncovers the problem, which needs to be solved by lots of daring do, and then we have to get a band of unlikely travellers who, of course, start off with no relationship to each other at all and don't like each other very much, probably, and then obviously go through great perils together in order to satisfy said quest. And by the end, they're best buddies and firm friends forever, having accomplished said quest against all possible odds. There's that problem. Now, I do like a good quest. Okay, I've not got a problem with a good quest. A good quest is good, but it's like if you want to write a fantasy novel that doesn't have a medieval setting or a sort of faux medieval setting, because medieval life wasn't exactly like a fantasy novel. The funny thing is that you read the description of the Shire, and it's sort of like a version of England that actually, if us British people are honest, never really existed. Okay, it's sort of this lovely green rolling hills, and where there was a bit of farming in the afternoon maybe, and in the morning you'd have a smoke and lean on the things and chat to your neighbours, and the river would run by. It was always sunny, and there was plenty of food, and then you'd have a nice meet up in the pub and share tales of the day over a pint of beer. It sounds lovely, but it's never really based on anything that's actually approaching reality. But it's sort of an aspirational thing, I think, for the British. As I've sort of noticed as you talk to some people, it's like that is perfection. Okay, green rolling hills, summer afternoon, down the pub before you come home again, plenty of food, nice sort of summery, not too hot weather. That's the British ideal. A sort of exactly, a terribly gentrified Cotswold. That's exactly what it is in the Shire. Shire is very much the UK, okay, and then once you leave the borders of the Shire, of course, it's ghastly and it's horrible and it's full of foreigners. It's very, very British. Not quite sure where Rivendell is, but the Shire is definitely the UK. There's no doubt about it. If there were technology, technology doesn't. I mean, this is an interesting thing. Some fantasy has managed to blend technology with magic, and some hasn't. So that one I think is quite a good thing. A good quest is good. That's not very descriptive of me, is it? Now, so coupled with the quest is usually there's the ultimate evil thing. Now, we've talked about evil overlords before, and they've definitely got problems as we discussed. But there's, Tolkien's is the archetypical one. Is there is a thing, okay? There is a talisman of great evil, which is problematic in some way. Okay, either it destroys anybody who touches it, which is bad, or it possesses them, and turns them evil, or and one of the things I do like about Tolkien's The Ring is that it's relatively subtle. It's not like it's shouting about its power. It is just intrinsically evil, but in a sort of slow kind of it slowly saps you away, and turns you bad. The Shire is Kent, is it? Excellent. In that case, I live in the Shire, bag in, the Shire is full of spite and backstabbing. You've been to the UK then. Rivendell is Jersey. Or Geneva says. Mordor is France. That's a bit mean. Dear. Actually, if you work out the scale of the map, I mean, how far did they come? I mean, the Misty Mountains must be quite long. I don't know how many miles. I'd have to look up roughly if the Shire was Kent, which of course it isn't. Where would Mordor be? But probably somewhere south of Italy, actually, about that distance. Somewhere around there. Dear, quite funny. But you've got all these sort of problems. So you've got that kind of intrinsic evil thing that you've got to deal with. So the One Ring is an example, and in my own little works, Lords of Midnight, you have the Ice Crown, which is the embodiment of evil powerless, which the baddie either needs to repossess or has in his possession or something like that. And plucky adventurers have to somehow contrive a way to either get rid of said evil thing or steal it and deal with it in some fashion. Wizard Vision Drew sitting on his front porch smoking. Dear. I'd love to be able to blow. That's one thing I would like to be able to, not that I smoke, but I'd love to be able to blow a smoke ring, or even better, blow a ship. Like Gandalf does. That'd be awesome. Have Drew down for coarse shag in his pipe, of course. That's a very good qualification there. I like that one. 1988 says, having insulted the whole of the French community by claiming that France is Mordor, it must be below the Mediterranean. If Middle Earth is actually at all related, I don't know. Is because it's a bit. I'm a bit confused actually by that, because in the beginning of, is it Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit? It sort of claims that the events of the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings obviously they take place in the Third Age, whatever the Third Age is, and then it's sort of indicated that maybe it's in the past of our own reality as opposed to a separate fantasy world, in which case Middle Earth is arguably somewhere that maybe used to exist. Not sure if Tolkien was ever entirely clear on that. Maybe Mordor is at the bottom of the Mediterranean. I don't know. So after the talk of Kent as the Shire, I just went on a drawing of hobbits in Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires and orcs in Messerschmitts. That would be a bit different. That's probably taking that allegory too far, I think. But there we go. Never mind. But you do have these problems. So you've got the evil overlord, which we've already discussed. You've got the quest. You've got the sort of faithful travelling companions, some of who are expendable and will get killed, Sean Bean style. Poor old Sean Bean. I always feel really sorry when he turns up in a fantasy movie, because I think, he's dead. It's inevitable. He's going to die. That's an interesting point, actually, Lucky Luigi. Mordor is east, but evil and dark-skinned people come from the south. Don't look at me, I didn't write it. No, I mean, is that a thing that Tolkien was sort of subconsciously, channeling there, or is that being unfair to the old chap? The UK is this wonderful place called the Shire, and we must defend it against all, and everything bad comes from the south and the east. Is that it's not at all supported by history, of course, but I wonder if he thought that in some strange fashion. I don't know. The past narrator, we don't really know who the narrator was. Yes, so there is a narrator in there, because he talks about the Red Book, doesn't he? The Red Book of something, which in my head seems to be the copy of the Hobbit that ended up, here with us or something. I don't know. Kelly Bagstar says no. Melkor. That's a good point. Melkor was in the north because the land of Angbad or Angabad or something, and that's where the Witch King, the other Witch King, the top baddie, Sauron's boss. He had a realm in the north, didn't he? So that's a good point, actually. And south of the Corsairs of Umbar and the Men of Harad. That's right. I think it was a bit of a zeitgeist thing, not that he was. No, I don't think. I mean, I don't like applying those sort of labels to people. A, they're dead. They can't really defend themselves, can they? Red Book. There we go. The Red Book of Westmarch, which is the story from The Hobbit. Okay, so those sort of things. Just need to sail west, Drew, to go to paradise. The USA. Just kidding. Yeah, you can imagine all the elves rocking up on the coast of New York. Is this the Everlasting Isle? You can't park here. He says with a very bad American accent. So yes, that's probably not great for the elves if they rock up in New York Harbour. It's not going to be. That could be an interesting story, though. So yeah, so there's those problems. Okay, so there's the quest. There's the evil thing that you need to deal with. There's the there's the evil overlord himself, which we've discussed, and then the quest and the travelling companions. Then you've also got the sort of the chosen one is either because of some strange virtue, this person ends up being the one person who has to deal with it. And Lord of the Rings falls guilty into this one because whilst Frodo basically goes, has that lovely speech where he basically goes, I wish, such things had never happened, and Gandalf goes very wisely back with, well, so do all who encounter such times, but it's not for them. And that's a really nice speech there. Anyway, it's a good one. And in the film that happened in Moria, whereas in the book it happens really early on, one of the early chapters. But Frodo is sort of a chosen one. He basically, and even Gandalf says, well, it seems like, or I think Elrond, I deem this to be the way it's supposed to be. You've kind of got that sort of strange mysticism that says, actually, yes, Frodo, you're quite right. It is your destiny. All that sort of destiny stuff. So that is a thing. And sometimes, and then you've got the sort of, you've got different versions of the chosen one. There's the one who ends up with the power to do something about the evil thing, which is sort of the Frodo thing. But you've also got the ancestral chosen one who, through no fault of their own, is descended from some ancient line of people, and it's you're the last of your line type problem, which is of course where Aragorn comes in. And you've got to live up to the deeds of your elders or undo the harm that they did many generations ago. So all of those things are quite staples of fantasy novels. Kenny Bags says, I've always read that as, you're lumbered with it, little chap. It's your ring, you deal with it. Yo, Elrond, I'm walking here. Maybe Canada is the paradise to it. And then, how does one get to Cardigal? Dear. Yeah, that would be quite a funny story if the elves rocked up in the West. It turned out to be the USA. That could be quite funny. So those are the things, and I don't know. I've not tried it, you see, because the fantasy novels that I've written have been based on somebody else's work. I haven't written yet my own fantasy novel, and I'm having thought about it a bit in the week, because I come up with my Monday stream. I think, what am I going to talk about? I have a bit of a think about it, and I was thinking, if I was going to write a fantasy novel, I would have to find a way to avoid some of those tropes. Okay, so I wouldn't, if it was going to be just me, I wouldn't want to write a story which was the chosen one has to save the landscape from everlasting darkness because the Dark Lord is going to sweep all before him with a cloud of darkness. And then the descendants of XYZ will rise again. And rally the good men of the West and to defeat the everlasting darkness. I couldn't write something like that. I just couldn't do it. And whereas I quite like reading it, particularly in Lord of the Rings, and I have no problem with obviously what Mike Singleton did with Lords of Midnight and all that sort of stuff. I'm a great fan of that sort of storytelling. It's very entertaining. It's very easy to access, I suppose, and it's quite you know where you are with a classic fantasy quest. But I would find it, if I was to write that myself as a writer, I would find it, you just can't get away from Tolkien. There's just no way you can get away from it. And so I'd have to have a world where I didn't have dwarves and elves and goblins and orcs and things, because I just, I'd go, because I'd like, well, everyone knows what an elf is, and everyone knows what a goblin is, and everyone knows what a dwarf is. I'm not going to do my orc impression again for Alien. So and then then the writer part of me would be going, okay, well, if you haven't got a chosen one, you haven't got an ancestral heir, you haven't got elves, dorks, goblins, and all that sort of stuff, then you're going to have to dump. I probably wouldn't be happy with the faux medieval background. And there's have I actually got a fantasy novel left if I take all that out? Okay. Trolls, yes, trolls as well, and then dragons, of course. Dragons are another one. Everyone knows what a fae is. Yeah, I mean, fae. Actually, I thought Mike Singleton was very clever with the use of the word fae, because it's it kind of goes with the free, which of course is what the race of men are called in Lords of Midnight, and the fae are quite clearly elves by another name, aren't they? But so that is a bit problematic. And if you take all of those elements out, as a writer, if you want to do something original and you decide to yourself, I'm going to take all those elements out and do something else, do you really have a fantasy novel? And even if you look at stuff that isn't epic fantasy, so going back to something like J.K. Rowling, okay, with Harry Potter and stuff, there's still a troll in the dungeon, isn't there? There's still a dragon that crops up. You still got goblins, and although they run the bank, which is quite funny. I always quite like those guys in the bank. They look a lot over like some of the colleagues I used to know at KPMG. They even look the same. It's quite scary. There's a troll in the dungeon, so it's quite it's quite hard to come up with a fantasy novel, and I'm not a comedic writer, so I couldn't be Terry Pratchett or Douglas Adams. I don't know if I've even got a single comedy novel in me. I don't know whether I could write something like that. My work tends to be serious in the sense that it's not jokey. Some of the characters may crack the odd witticism or something, but it's not designed to be a comedy, the stuff that I write. And so I'm kind of thinking I'd like to write a fantasy novel, but I don't want to follow that sort of pre-programmed track. So what do you do about it? What do you do about it? How is there a way to mix that up without actually going down, oh no, it's the chosen one with the magic bomb again. Have I ever seen the Witcher series? No, I haven't. I have heard some good things about it, so that's interesting. No, I haven't. You take all that out and you end up with Downton Abbey. Now, I quite like the idea, so I think magic is something that I could play around with quite well. The problem I have, the other thing, Mike Singleton did rather well with the Fae, which are kind of elves, but they're not called elves, and they're the Fae. But if you try and invent another made-up name to describe a race, then the problem with them not being elves or not being things is you have to either kind of associate them with the elves or the dwarves or the goblins or the trolls, or you have to come up with a brand new description for them and then try and figure out what they are, which means you have to put quite a lot of exposition into the story to tell your reader what you're dealing with. Now I suppose an example of where this has been done rather well, actually, that has just come to mind, is Michael Moorcock. And if you haven't read his series, those are, I suppose, they are fantasy novels. They're definitely on the edge of a genre there, because they're sort of set in a not really plausible, but certainly set in the future of now. It's the impression you get from Michael Moorcock is there's been some cataclysmic war at some point in the future, and what's left afterwards is still recognisably, at least bits of it are recognisably here. So it's actually set in Europe, I suppose it is a fantasy because there's all sorts of weird magical stuff that he concocts, but he doesn't use elves and dwarves and trolls and things. He just has people, but with some very fantastical kind of constructs. So that, I suppose, is actually quite good. I don't know whether Michael Moorcock, he's another one of these fantasy writers who didn't really like Tolkien and wanted to get away from that elves and dwarves and troll problem. So if you've read Michael Moorcock, maybe that's a good sort of thing. I must admit, I remember reading that as probably 15, 16, 17-year-old back in the mid-80s, and being quite impressed that it wasn't Tolkien, unlike everything else I'd read at around time, which seemed to be very derivative of. So Neil Gaiman, yes, and Neil Gaiman stuff is good. Yes, you've got to give him credit there as well. Seems like the fantasy genre and sci-fi both are pretty pigeonholed. Yeah, so I think there's definitely issues. I mean, and this is one thing. I mean, I love both genres. Okay, I will sit and read a fantasy and sci-fi novel without any trouble at all in part of my head. But the writing part of me, if I want to create one, that's a different kettle of fish. It's a different bag of cliches. That's the bit where, and this is the thing. I mean, we started these streams by talking about the problems I was having putting together ideas for my next sci-fi series, and wanting it to be true to science, which is problematic. But fantasy is, there aren't so many rules, I don't think, in fantasy novels. But I would still want, as a writer, because it's my sort of style, I'd still want it to be very, very constrained by the rules of a particular society. So, if magic works in a particular way in one chapter, you can't suddenly change the rules. Magic works a different way in another chapter. That's the sort of stuff that I want to play with. I want to constrict the world so it's believable, if that makes sense. And in my science fiction work, I've constricted it down very hard. You can't break the laws of physics. That's really, really irritating. Now, in the magical world, magic doesn't obey the laws of physics. You just can't have that. That's not acceptable. But magic still has to, I personally think, obey some rules. I always used to quite like, although I didn't understand it, I used to quite like the way in Dungeons and Dragons, I don't know if you've ever played it, but when your magic users used to cast a spell, they could cast a spell, but then they forgot the spell, and they had to spend quite a lot of time relearning it, so that it was like a recharge cycle, which obviously was a bit gamified, but it was at least a reasonable explanation for why they couldn't just rattle off lots of spells all the time. The actual casting of the spell sort of erased it from their memory, and they had to kind of relearn it, which sort of manage it. Now, if you're going to put a rule like that in, and I think that's not necessarily the best rule, but it's a rule. It limits how powerful magic can be. It's a force that can be used, but it has its limitations. And I think good storytelling exists in some of those limitations. So okay, well, our magic users run out of magic at the moment, so we're going to have to defend him with old school swords because that's where we are right now. That sort of stuff is good. It adds tension, because otherwise magic people can just nope. So one thing I like about Lord of the Rings actually is, if you think about it, Gandalf is a wizard, okay, and he's mentioned as a wizard many, many, many times throughout Lord of the Rings, and in the books in particular. You hardly ever see him using any magic. He's quite wise, and he's clearly got a good memory and likes telling stories. But you see, you hear about his fireworks at the beginning. You hear about it sort of third person that he deals with the Black Riders on Weathertop. You see him light a light in the Mines of Moria, and and he faces off the Balrog, of course. But that's about it. He doesn't wave his wand around and cast a lot of spells. He's very reserved with his use of magic, and magic in the Lord of the Rings series overall is quite a subdued thing, which I think is actually rather nice. It's actually rather good. Very Forgetful Wizards, yeah. Magic needs limits, or magic user. See, that's right. The problem, if you make it too powerful, then magic is like. That's some of the problems that J.K. Rowling had, by introducing too much magical powers. Is it's like, why can't you just swish and flick all your problems away? That's an issue. And so Gandalf knows magic can be very dangerous. So he knows not to wield it unsafely, I suppose. But I always found that sort of level, that there was a sort of ancient magicness to the world that people could sort of tap into in the Lord of the Rings environment if they knew how to. Was quite good. Most people went through their lives actually not even witnessing or even being able to practice magic. It's not a very visible thing in the Lord of the Rings environment, which I think is rather good. Yeah, he's very good there, Hubris. He's more of a sage than a mage. That's excellent. And fantasy can cover many things. No, I suppose so. Fantasy can ebb and flow between the two things. I mean, you've got, I suppose, there are, and I as you know, I've said this before, I'm not a big fan of genres because I find them very constricted. Because the moment you categorise something, then there's something that doesn't quite sit in the category and straddles the line, doesn't there? So that's not. I don't think they're particularly useful, but you do have in fantasy genres, you'd have the concept of high fantasy and epic fantasy and these various other things. And I suppose epic fantasy is, if you're going to write 6 books and call them a novel in 3 volumes, you're probably in epic land. And if you need various appendices to accompany your story and lots of maps, you're probably in epic. You're probably in the epic realm, are you? So Gandalf is a mayor, so technically a supernatural demigod creature equal to Balrog. Yeah, so I always found that Gandalf never seemed to be that powerful, did he? Whether he was a bit worn down and a bit tired after all his labours, but he never seemed to be quite in the. Although I know he is, you're quite right, Lucky Luigi, but he never seems to be quite at that level in Lord of the Rings, does he? Maybe until he comes back as Gandalf the White, but. And it's a difficult thing to define. What do we mean by fantasy? Because anything can be a fantasy, can't it? It's something that's made up and relatively unbelievable in the context of the modern world. That's a fantasy. But I suppose I'm talking about your kind of classic, otherworldly, magic-y, strange creatures sort of fantasy. But there's plenty of stories that fit into that which are not epic high fantasy. But in that space, Tolkien's influence is absolutely enormous. I think mages would be kind of corrupt and channel magic into a power source by technology, and rule the world by control of the supply, and nobody can learn how to use it. Yeah, you see, it would be an easy power to abuse, wouldn't it? Magic. So Lord of the Rings fell down literally for me when Gandalf fell through the earth fighting the Balrog. I haven't got I haven't got to the bit where it explains what happened to him. All I've seen in the book so far is that he's fallen off the bridge and the Balrog's fallen with him by catching him with his whip. In the film, obviously, they fall down through the mountains and end up in a lake near the bottom, don't they? And then somehow they get back to the top of the mountain where they have a fight and Gandalf dispatches the Balrog. But funnily enough, J1988 says, I did read somewhere that epic is defined more so by having lots of characters, whereas going on a grand journey across huge landscapes is sprawling. Okay, sprawling fantasy. So fantasy worlds are worlds in which the rules are different to ours. So that's quite good. And they could be physical. Now, see, a lot of people would class Star Wars as science fiction, but it isn't really. It's sort of fantasy because it's all completely made up. It just happens to have spaceships in it, which tend to make people think. The moment people think of spaceships and space and lasers, they tend to think science, which of course is completely wrong because we can't make spaceships do that. We can't make laser swords do that. We can't make lasers even do that. None of that stuff can happen in reality at all. So it certainly isn't good science fiction. I suppose it comes under a genre of space opera. And that's the problem with these genres is where do you draw the lines? Because Star Wars has got the Force in it, which really is indistinguishable from magic, isn't it? You can do things with the Force, which you can't do. So that's definitely a fantasy in that sort of sense of the word fantasy. But I don't know. The whole. There's definitely a tendency with fantasy to go back to that sort of medieval thing where everybody carries around a sword and there are dragons. That sort of slightly odd medieval style of world. Kind of European medieval as well, because most, and I don't know if that's just a function of the people who write those novels, that maybe they're Europeans generally, because that sort of swords and not that sort of sword culture and knights that are travelling around doing honourable things, all that sort of stuff is very European. In a particular age of Europe, which didn't last all that long. I suppose you can TV shows like Stargate have kind of brought in your Egyptian culture and some of those other things, which shake things up a bit. You sometimes have some of the different cultures rather than the kind of classic European medieval ones. So that's quite good. Or you bring in the Greeks or the Romans or anything like that, something a little bit older as your fantasy setting. but certainly Tolkien was very faux medieval in the sense of bows and arrows and horses and mounted armies and all that kind of stuff. So until the day I die, we use the term soft sci-fi to describe things like Star Wars as opposed to hard sci-fi. Yeah, and so it's difficult, and this is the thing. I don't like genres, as I've already mentioned, because it doesn't really help very much. I mean, do you need to even categorize these things anyway? The problem I've had is I've had an awful lot of people over the years who basically, and they've said, what sort of books are yours then, Drew? And I said, well, it's sort of science fiction, but it's got a sort of fantasy feel to it. And they go, oh, I don't read fantasy. And you go, in that case, it's a science fiction book. And then you get the opposite. It goes, well, I don't, science fiction is a bit too highbrow for me. I prefer fantasy. Oh, it's a fantasy novel then. And you kind of like, no, don't constrict yourself by genre. It's a very, very bad thing to do. Is genre actually a helpful thing? Does it help? I don't know. I'm not sure. So so it would be. I mean, Glenn, that's a really good question. Are there any modern fantasy novels which are more in Japanese or Chinese or even Indian tradition? So there's a. I mean, Tolkien obviously was influenced by Norse legends and all that sort of stuff. So there's no need for a fantasy novel to be set in a imaginary Europe of yesteryear and people with Western mythological traditions. I mean, why not? If you've done the research, which I haven't, but you could do it. Why not do the research into the myths and legends of other cultures and use that? I mean, is that because of the audience that you're writing for, or is it because that's where you culturally originate from? I'm not aware of any fantasy novels that are set in let's say an amalgam of Japan or something like that. I mean, that would be quite interesting, wouldn't it? Or even India. I mean, all those sort of places have lots and lots of myths and legends, and maybe they would make. I mean, certainly China had dragons and all sorts of stuff, didn't it? So yeah, I don't know. That's a very good point. Historical fiction is fantasy while staying true to our rules. Yeah. So I quite like historical fiction, i.e., you're writing a made-up story but set in a contemporary time that actually did happen. That's quite interesting. That isn't what I would call fantasy, though, I suppose. So that's quite interesting. CJ Cherry does some based on Russian fairy characters. Okay, so I must admit, I quite like the idea of basing a fantasy novel on Scottish and maybe some Irish myths and legends. There's some excellent stuff there that you can play around with, but that's been done as well. So if you wanted to write something original, it's quite tricky. Magician featured an alien civilization based on medieval Korea invading. Okay, that's quite good. Kellywan. Oh right. Okay. So there are stuff there. So that's quite interesting. So I think. You're more likely it depends what you want to do as a writer, because it very much depends on I'm off to write Tea in the Nog. Yeah. Another Spectrum game. I think it depends what you want to do as a writer. So as a young lad, I remember in my sort of late teens, probably 16, 17, 18, wanting to write a Tolkien-y story. I was just, I liked Tolkien. I thought I'll write my own one, and I actually did. Unfortunately, it's one of the first kind of proper stories I suppose I ever finished writing. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of it, which is a real shame, because I'd love to read it now and see how bad it was, because it was pretty appalling, I'm sure. But I remember at the time being rather proud of it, because I'd finished the story, and my guys had gone on the quest and solved something. And presumably everything had worked out fine in the end. But I remember it was kind of like, I want to write a Tolkien-y type story. It was very much, it's got to be a quest. It's got to have an evil bad guy. It's got to have a bunch of travelling companions. And I was very taken by that as a writer, as a young man. That was the sort of thing that I wanted to write. And I'm not quite sure what the appeal was, whether it's just comforting or whether it's it's familiar and sort of like a bit like an old blanket. Oh, a nice, sensible, normal fantasy novel. Perfect. I don't know. That would be quite good. Highlander, of course. Yeah. So that, I suppose, is that a fantasy? I suppose it is, isn't it? So you've got these sort of immortal beings, sword and sorcering themselves down throughout history. And yeah, Highlander's a great film. Scottish wizards going around headbutting people. Yeah, Scottish wizards. That'd be quite good fun. To be fair, Earthsea isn't European medieval fantasy either. It's more Bronze Age and definitely not based in Europe. Yeah, so the people have done variations, which is good. It's a relatable package, I suppose. I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? If you're going down that route, you kind of know. I mean, in the case of Tolkien, Bilbo and Frodo, the two kind of heroes of the story, they're not going to die, are they? I mean, there are going to be a few deaths along the way. Sean Bean always dies, There was an online petition a few years ago. Stop Sean Bean from being killed, because he just dies in everything. If it's a fantasy novel and Sean Bean's in it, he's dead. And I don't think he's survived any of them thus far. So it's a sort of relatable. It is that relatable thing. You're quite right. The hero basically has to go on a quest against what appear to be insuperable odds, and for some reason always manages to prevail. Which, as a writer, isn't very satisfactory. Okay, unless you can do some clever twisting. Okay, with what does prevail actually mean, or in the case of something that I try to do with Shadewood actually is you're kind of trying to work out who the goodie and the baddie actually is, because certainly at the beginning of the story it's deliberately kept vague as to is there a goodie and a baddie in this story, whereas in sort of epic fantasy there's no doubt that Gandalf and Frodo and Elrond are the good guys, and Sauron and Saruman are the despots. That's pretty clear. He's the Dark Lord. He's pretty much described like that right from the beginning. The Dark Lord is evil. Okay, he's bad. He wants to cover the land in everlasting darkness. Why? But he wants to cover the land in everlasting darkness. Okay, that's fine then. Right, we got to defeat him because he's the evil Lord. And. Whereas I was trying to write something whereby, okay, when you look at the characters, you start off looking at the characters and going, okay, well, they're just characters, okay, and they're having pretty crappy lives, all of them. Are they the baddies? Are they goodies? Are the baddies not yet come along? And then you, hopefully, as you get into the story, you realise actually there aren't any goodies and baddies. There's just folk. And I think if I was going to, and I will probably do this at some point in the future, I will try and write a fantasy novel or a volume or a series of books or something. And I think when you read it, it will be a case of actually, yes, maybe there's some magic, and maybe there's some armies, and maybe there's a bit of medieval Europe in there as well. But who's the bad guy? I don't think it's going to be very clear, because that's more my type of storytelling, I suppose. That's me as a writer. So Frodo gets not killed lots of times, stabbed at Firetop, then speared in the mines, and then by the so he manages to get out of dodge rather well, doesn't he, old Frodo? But Sean Bean always dies. Matt Damon's always lost or forgets who he is. Yeah. You should take a look at Orkney folklore, an interesting mix of Celtic and Nordic tales. Okay, well that's quite interesting. Thanks for that, Commander O'Connor. Yeah, I'll definitely do that. And not getting eaten by orcs. Yeah. So Frodo has quite a lot of luck, it has to be said. But surely true fantasy would not be based on any earth culture. Well, it's difficult not to be inspired by things, isn't it? Because magic. What's the origin of magic? We've got this culture of magic being this force that some of us could summon up and do that. Is that a reflection of our powerlessness, at least historically, against the elements? And our way of explaining coincidences and all sorts of things. Some of us would attribute that to God, some of it attribute it to magic powers, or influential. Magic. Magic is a very, very common part of many shared cultures. It appears to have kind of cropped up in culture all over the shop. I mean, there's no basis in fact for magic at all, as far as I'm aware. Unless some of you can conjure things out of thin air, I mean, I'd like to see that. But and I think actually, I don't know if you guys resonate with this or not, but I must admit I have an intrinsic dislike of what I would call sleight of hand. And that's what magic is in, if you like, in a modern context. In magic tricks, I'm talking about sleight of hand. I really don't like it. Okay, I don't like it because it's not actual magic, and that and it's not to take anything away from the skill of the people who practice sleight of hand magic tricks and all that sort, because it's very, very incredibly clever. But my rational brain goes, that isn't magic. That's a trick. Whereas, and there's part of me that wants magic to real magic to actually be true, and I almost find there's a sort of sense of, I don't know, almost distaste for trickery in the form of, rather than magic, because I want to believe, but I know it's not true. I suppose it's something like that. I'm not quite sure how I'm articulating it very good, and it's just, I find this, and I have the same reaction with sort of Santa Claus, Father Christmas and his elves. I don't like them because they trivialise elvishness to me, whereas I tend to think of elves as these sort of rather lovely sort of superhuman beings who inhabit the forests, singing songs and taking an awful long time to do anything, whereas the Christmas elves are rather silly, funny creatures that help Father Christmas. And I get presents ready every year, and I don't like them. Because for no really good reason. I just don't like them. It's an odd thing, and I don't like magic tricks, and I don't like Christmas elves because they're not proper elves and they're not proper magic in that order. I don't know. It's that's weird. I loved sleight of hand tricks when I was a kid, but when I learned there was no such thing as magic, then I was really disappointed. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's something to do with that. Maybe it's the disillusionment that it's not actually real. Drew wants actual magic. I do. I mean, I would be a very bad person to give actual magic to, because I'd use it for mischief very, very quickly. But Freaky Deaky Dude has a knack of conjuring an empty bank balance quite often. Yes. That's an interesting one, Cleonimus there. It's an expression of a childhood fantasy where the seemingly powerless are in fact the most powerful. Now that's interesting. That's interesting because, I mean, I don't know about you guys. I mean, we probably all experienced difficult times in our childhood. Now, I was bullied at school for a considerable number of years by a bunch of, just nasty, quite nasty kids. And that will definitely have influenced me, and my retreat in some ways into fantasy and sci-fi books was an escape from that, and a way of kind of dealing with it. And I must admit, I probably fantasized whacking them over the head with a sword or magicking them out of existence as part of my childhood therapy of trying to cope with the experience of childhood. And some of my school days were thoroughly miserable times as a result. And so fantasy and sci-fi novels and all that sort of associated stuff are an escapism from that sort of pretty crappy school life. That's quite insightful, actually. That's possibly part of it. I have a deep inside longing for magic to be real, so I can take revenge on people who annoyed me over the years. Wouldn't that be fantastic? You over there, I'm going to magic you out of existence. Poof. I don't know. So I'd say a true fantasy wouldn't start with a hero with influences on both to force them down the destiny should be clear. Well, having an established background character. Now, Tolkien does do that, to be fair, with Sauron, and even Gandalf admits, Sauron wasn't evil to start with. Which is, there's a bit of character development there. Not much that's alluded to in Lord of the Rings, but a bit. There's a very clever film called Oculus about a supposedly haunted mirror, and there was a debate about whether a mirror is truly magic or whether it's an illusion. So that sort of stuff is quite clever. It's quite thought-provoking, isn't it? Tolkien's elves are much, much better than folklore, pixies, sprites and gnomes, etc. Yeah. Sapphire says, interesting, I never knew them as magic tricks. It was always a card trick or something without the word magic. Maybe it's a language thing, yeah. Maybe it is. I mean, I've always seen magicians, and by the word magician I mean somebody who practices a magic trick, quite often wave a wand over the thing, even though obviously that's just theatrics. So maybe I associate wand waving and stuff. I don't know. Or the wand would suddenly go floppy for no apparent reason because it's going to be on the end of a piece of string. I don't know. So Chris Viking, yeah, fantasy was definitely something that helped me escape from daily life and bullying at school. So some of us will have had experiences like that, and I remember actually thinking about it now. I remember very strongly as a child wishing I could transport myself to the world of Lord of the Rings. I remember thinking I would be much happier in the environment of Lord of the Rings than I would be in what was then my school and home life. I remember thinking that very clearly, wishing I was there rather than here. Whereas nowadays, of course, I would probably think the opposite because I've got I've got a warm shower. I've got food on the table. I haven't got to go tramping through the wilderness, face a dark lord, and camp in the middle of nowhere on freezing cold evenings, and I can have a shower whenever I want. Etc. Etc. It obviously looking at it through rose tinted viewpoint there as a child, interesting. It sounds like most of us are. So I mean, school. I mean, I don't know. Don't want to get too maudlin about it, but school. I did not enjoy school for all sorts of reasons. I wasn't particularly good at school, in terms of academic achievement, I was very much a loner. For all sorts of reasons, and I was quite happy being a loner if only people would leave me alone, which of course they wouldn't, because of course the mistake I made, which it took me several years to figure out, was that people like to pick on people who get upset about being picked on. If I just ignored them, they probably would have gone away and picked on somebody else. My fundamental mistake was to react to being bullied. And that didn't go down very well because I was a relatively small child. I was the youngest in the year because I was born in August and our school year starts in September. So I was always small for my year, and physically I was very small as well. So it's kind of the sort of 7-stone weakling standing up against the much bigger boys. I was always getting my ass kicked at school. My stupid, there was something in me that I would always try and fight, and I would always lose, but hence I kept getting bullied. So it was very, very stupid. So I just kept getting beaten up. I don't know. My strategy didn't work. I mean, maybe you had a better one. School kids tend to be a lot crueler than orcs. Yeah, I mean, school was horrendous as far as I was concerned. It was just a case of anarchy between lessons. And if you sat, my technique in the classes was to sit as near to the teacher as I could, because then people couldn't chuck stuff at me. But it was open season in between lessons, and it was a case of it was survival tactics throughout the entire day. It was very, very tiring. I mean, how I learned anything, because I was always on my guard. Someone's going to try and ambush me in between lessons. So it was appalling, actually. I mean, and I don't know whether it's as bad like that in schools nowadays, but it was absolute anarchy between lessons. The teachers didn't give outside of their lessons, the teachers didn't give a monkey. It was borderline dangerous, actually, at times. I mean, some of the things. I mean, I did them too. I was no innocent, So don't get this impression of Dru as this, angelic figure who is just being set upon by the powers of darkness all the time. I gave as good as I got, in many cases, and I got into lots of trouble as well. I did actually get the cane once. I mean, can you imagine that? I got caned. I actually got whacked with a stick at school. For getting caught, actually, and I did deserve it, but I did feel a bit aggrieved because not everybody else got caned at the same time. We used to have proper corporal punishment in schools, and we used to get hit by the teachers with sticks. I mean, it's just so dodgy nowadays. So fighting generally did make the problem worse. I didn't cotton on to the fact that if I stopped trying to fight back, then it would get better until I got a bit older than I realised. I did eventually make some friends. That helps, actually. Having some friends does actually help, because then at least the odds are a little bit more even sometimes. I got sent. Blue Enemy says I got sent to Coventry by my whole class because no one bothered to tell me that we were boycotting the geography homework. Oops! It lasted for 2 days before the guy I sat next to could stand it anymore because I wasn't even trying to talk to him. Oh dear, that's horrible. Oh dear. I shame bully, says Glenn. I wanted to beat me up. I would shout that all the looky loos would hear. Oh, you're so tough beating up on me like I'm a big challenge and they usually left me alone. Dear. School. It was just a nightmare. I did not enjoy school at all. I remember. I'm just remembering some of the things I did now. I remember there was a particularly stupid bully actually, I don't know whether he must have done something like just grabbed my pencils and chucked them across the room, so I had to go pick them up or something like that, and we had these. I don't know if anybody else remembers it. We had these wooden folding desks, which you kind of lift up, and then you're supposed to put your school books in, and then close the lid, and then you sit on it and write on it. And I remember this bully would come along, open my desk, grab all my stuff out of my desk, and chuck it on the floor just before the teacher turned up. And then one day he did this, grabbed all my stuff, chucked it on the floor, and I said, "You've missed my pen. I've still got my pen. It's in my drawer." So anyway, so I pulled up the flap and said, "Look, there it is." And the bully leant over and I whacked the thing back on his head. And then, of course, there was a fight, which I lost. But it was quite satisfying at the time. Oh, it was... no, school was something to be endured, wasn't it? Oh, dear. I hated school. Anyway... So that's maybe that's where some of the violence in my stories comes from. Is there was a lot of getting beaten up and things at school, and actually some of the. I had a friend. I got through school. To be fair, I got through school without any major injuries at all. I got into fights and I got into scuffles, and there was a bit of kicking and punching and black eyes and stuff. But I never got seriously injured. Whereas one of my friends actually did get seriously injured in a fight. Actually got proper head injuries and never was really quite the same again afterwards. So it was actually in some places a actually properly dangerous environment where you could actually get hurt. But fortunately I managed to avoid that. But yeah, I don't know. Is that part of my great longing and desire for sci-fi and fantasy novels? I'm not sure. Trying to right the wrongs of the... I think it's got to have an influence, hasn't it? That sort of traumatic. I think it was actually surprisingly traumatic environment. Certainly, I've never felt fear ever since in the same way as I remember feeling it at school. That's how profound it was. Whether or not that fear was genuinely actually a real danger, I'm not sure, but I genuinely felt fear at school, and I've never felt those sort of emotions quite the same way in my adult life. So tells you something about the great British education system. I don't know. Slaps the kid's head. Yeah. So I did give as good as I got in many cases, but what I failed to realise is that violence begets violence, and it just got worse the more I fought back. So it was pretty bad. So that's the settings for fire: standing up to impossible odds using whatever means are available to remedy the situation. So I did get quite good at running, actually. I was quite a good long distance runner. But there we go. I don't know. My friend got his hand broken in a fight at school. They shoved his hand in the bike wheel. Youch! Oh, wow! Oh, yeah. They were pretty nasty. I remember having my hand held in the Bunsen for a few brief seconds. That moment when you had to get in the classroom but the teacher hadn't arrived. That was the most dangerous point of the entire day. Because there were all sorts of things that you could cause mischief with, and then and the teacher would, I don't know what the teacher was doing, but they weren't there for the first few minutes of the class, and that was a very, very dangerous time. Alan Ackmore's play Way Upstream has great revenge on the bully who's seriously injured by his victim. Wow, okay, that's interesting. Sometimes our school days were like a fancy novel trying to figure out how to get home without encountering them. Yeah, so it was a minefield trying to get home. without encountering the bullies. And I don't know. I'd love to know. I mean, I've still got. I don't know if you can see that. Actually, you probably still can. Yeah, you can. I don't know if that will. Will it show up on my knuckles there? I don't know if you can see that. It's not going to show up very well. Actually, no, I can't see it on the camera. But anyway, I've got 2 vertical scars there on my knuckles where I punched somebody. You know how you do in the movies? I thought, I'm just going to punch him. You know, when it's kind of Star Trek inspired, I think. You know, when they do plenty of roundhouse punches and they keep pummeling at each other until one of them goes, "Oh, I've had enough." Well, I thought, I'm just going to punch this guy. So I did, and I must have hit his jaw, I'm guessing, but I managed to lacerate my hand in so doing, and it was blood everywhere. And it was like that really hurt. I've never punched anything like that before, and I kind of thought, well, you just whack them and they go, "Ooh," and he basically collapsed on the flagstones, and my hand was like covered in blood. It wasn't at all good, and I've still got the scars actually, which is a bit weird because it was all had to be stitched up and stuff. So I don't know exactly what I did, but I just remember being that it doesn't work like it does in movies. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely something to be survived. So there's definitely a bit of post-traumatic stress disorder of just coping with comprehensive education at school. Yeah, it's oddly enough, a lot of people I've spoken to of my age seem to have very, very similar experiences at school. So I don't know if that's a contributing factor to escapism and love of fantasy and stuff, and wanting the good guys to prevail, maybe. So that's interesting. But I don't know if that connects to fantasy or not. Although I must admit, going along to conventions and stuff, fantasy does see. And conventions are strange places, and they don't necessarily, align to the great readership of fantasy and sci-fi novels. But if I was to make some probably unfounded generalizations about the sort of people I meet at conventions, they are rather like me, social misfits in some form or another. Okay, people who don't integrate well with normal or whatever normal society is. We find ourselves apart from it, and I still find this. This is getting quite serious now this evening, isn't it? I find myself even today not having a lot in common with most people I generally meet, and I'm pretty sure that most people I meet in my day-to-day life think I'm a bit odd, because I just find myself not thinking the same way as people. I don't have the same aspirations. I don't have the same outlook. I don't have, I've got this sort of otherworldliness. I'm always off with the fairies. Yeah, literally, kind of a bit. I remember, a couple of we had to do some sort of weird training when I was at one of my jobs, and this very nice lady showed us this picture of, an abstract picture, and I don't know what it was supposed to be of, but I looked at it and thought, well, that's and they basically, you were told to describe what you saw, and I sort of, so I started scribbling, could be a dragon, could be a portal to another dimension, all those sorts of things that instantly came to my mind. And then we were supposed to, at the end of this, sort of read out what we'd done, and I think I was about third in line. The first person sort of piped up with, it's a fire or something like that, and then so I piped up with, it looks like a portal to the netherworld or something like that. I just remember the entire room full of professional sort of executive types kind of just staring at me as if I just landed from Mars. So I don't know what the answer was, or there was supposed to be an answer, but I just wrote down what I felt, and it was obviously very, very much adrift from what everybody else was thinking in that particular environment. But I think it's okay to be different. I mean, I'm not bothered about it. It doesn't bother me, because I think that's where my creativity comes from. The fact that I can imagine with ease another world, another people, different people. A lot of my, dare I say it, fan mail has been people saying, your characters seem really realistic. I can really get alongside them, and there's me thinking, I've created these characters out of somewhere, sort of out of my imagination, and I'm kind of gratified that people feel that they're realistic characters and that they kind of admire or hate or love or whatever. They have a relationship with that person in the context of the story. But as to where that comes from, maybe having a sort of slightly problematic childhood is essential to being a writer. I don't know. What do you think? And actually, a few people have mentioned sort of autism and Asperger and things like that. Now, I am definitely a bit autistic. My mum tells me I didn't start to actually talk until I was 4 or 5 years old, which was seriously late, kind of under normal developmental kind of guidelines. I just didn't. What I used to do is, if I wanted something, I would get out a book. This is quite funny. I would get out a book that had pictures in it, point to a picture of the thing that I wanted, and sort of just gesture silently. I have no idea why I did that, but that's apparently what I did up until the age of about 5, and then I started speaking in full sentences. And I didn't do the kind of dog, cat, sky, bird thing. I never did that. I would just point at things in books for the first 5 years of my life, and then I would come out with full sentences. And my wife will absolutely 100% agree that I am definitely a bit autistic. I've got very selective hearing, she says. So is that a developmental issue, or maybe today it would have definitely been labelled as one. I was never diagnosed as having any particular thing back in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't something that was really done back then, I suppose. Whereas nowadays I'd certainly be on the spectrum somewhere, not the ZX spectrum, I hate to add, but on one of those Asperger type autism spectrum. I was I strongly, if I'm honest with myself, I strongly figure on the autism. And I suppose I've trained myself out of it because I've simply had to cope with the real world, as it were. But I've never felt all that comfortable with it. I've always felt like a bit of an outsider, no matter what I do and where I go. And it's, maybe that sort of creative, maybe that tension is actually where some of the stories come from, because there's part of me that wonders, in writing my stories, am I trying to create a place where I feel like I would actually be at home? And I'm trying to write a world or a universe in which the laws are the way I want them to be rather than the way they actually are. Which is potentially, why I feel compelled to write the stuff I do, because I think, right, this is my world. This is the way it's going to be. Okay, I'm going to decide how things should work out. I'm making up for it now, Drew. Yeah. Well, this is the funny thing. I mean, this is where those, these spectrums of things get a bit confusing, because I would very much class myself as an introvert most of the time. But I can be very extrovert as well. And people who don't know me very well will basically say, oh, Drew's absolutely an extrovert. He's always on doing this, he's always doing that, he's always trying to get out there and be friendly and stuff. But people who know me better will go, no, it's just the public feed. And I'm quite a private person. I like my own space, and my idea of heaven is an endless supply, as I've already mentioned, of strawberry bonbons, tea and good books. I'd be quite happy with that, and probably a nice sunny afternoon. But not too hot. That's kind of nirvana. And I like the company of people, but I also prefer, I think, my own company. If and the trick is, if you want to recharge, i.e., get your sort of strength back and your mental energy back and all that kind of stuff, where do you go? Is it with people, or would it be in total isolation? And for me, it would be total isolation. Hosting streams to possibly imaginary people, yeah. But I get a lot out of these streams because I'm just waffling on, reading your comments is like, it's a nice sort of level of connection. I'd love to meet some of you in person down the pub in the Shire. I'm sure we could have a grand old chat. But this is slightly different the way this works, isn't it? Just like in the joke about the kid who didn't talk because up until now everything was quite satisfactory. Selective hearing comes from being a husband. Talking wasn't a problem either until school started. I was a social kid, but then went through school and ended up I would walk everywhere with my face looking to pavement because I was basically... Yeah, so, I mean, school is as we've already talked at some of that, school is actually, for some of us, a horrendous environment. It really isn't. It doesn't suit a lot of us at all. I mean, I don't know if anybody who... I can't think of many people I go who think, school was great. I don't know. I don't know any of my friends who think, yep, school was great. On my walk home, when cars would come, I would often run into the woods and hide. It went that far. Yeah, I know where you're coming from, Chris. I mean, I have days where I physically find it difficult when there's lots of noise. And that can even come down to people talking. I just want them to not talk. You know, I'd stop making noise. Why can't the world be quiet for a little while? Sometimes like when Lucky Drew decided to become a writer and not a supervillain. There's still time, yeah. No, I make an excellent villain. Yeah, at times I'd be chuckling too much. If I became a villain, I would be doing the evil cackle far too much. Alan, this is getting very deep. I feel that when I'm writing, I'm revealing some deep-seated thoughts that some people might think was fake. I think. Yeah, I mean, I explore. I mean, actually thinking about it, it's interesting. The themes I've explored in Shadewood are, when I look at what I've done to some of the characters, it is actually in some ways similar to some of the experiences I've gone through myself. I mean, not necessarily very much physical danger as I've put my characters in, but certainly some of the emotional traumas and. A level of physical peril is stuff that I recall from my school days. That's actually quite interesting. I haven't even thought about it like that before. Maybe I'm exploring, maybe I'm repairing myself through the process of writing. I don't know, or exploring myself through the process of writing. I think there's very much an essence. One of the things I do recall very strongly from those years is I was very lucky actually. My parents got me a dog in my teenage years, and in many ways having to walk the dog twice a day was something that was my oasis of calm, because I would always take the dog for a walk before I went to school, and it'd be the first thing I did when I got home was take the dog for a walk. So I had these two little bookends to the atrociousness of school, which was this lovely, and I was fortunate where we lived when I was growing up was deep in the heart of the countryside. So once I got home and took the dog with me, I could get away into the countryside. And pretty much nobody else ever went there. So I was able to just, for 45 minutes in the morning and 45 minutes in the evening or so, just live in my own little world in the middle of the countryside. And that was my sort of recharge moment. And the only person I told my woes to was the dog. And I think that kept me sane actually through that traumatic period. And that, and I remember, mapping out the countryside where I lived in sort of Tolkien-esque sort of terms. There would be the mountains, and there would be the hills and the vales, and there'd be the river I had to cross. And I do remember doing that as a child. So maybe I would. Maybe that was a way of coping. I can go for days without saying a word. I could easily. I mean, it's not practical to do so, but. School was worse than prison could ever be. Yeah, so school I think was pretty atrocious. It wasn't good. It's a common thing with people on the autism spectrum. Too many impressions. It is exhausting. I find it tiring. Sci-Fi says the same. I would need time to recharge. Yeah, it's interesting how many of us subscribe to the same sort of feels there. Drew would also monologue like, I would be awful. So I'm now going to reveal the plan. You should listen while I explain how everything's going to happen. Chris Viking says, it's taken me 15 years of a job to become social at my current level. I'm short of preschool level, but I'm getting there at least. Yeah, so it is tough. It is tough. I don't underestimate how difficult that is. Were you chased through a snowy wasteland by people with flying dragons? I don't think I was, but I probably imagined that I was. It certainly felt like it. So it's interesting. Hope Hubris. I mean, mystifies me when the guest on Death Island confesses to be terrified of being alone. It wouldn't bother me in the slightest. I mean, I think I'd need to take some books and maybe a little bit of music along. But being alone for an extended period of time would not faze me at all. I mean, I spent years being alone in that sense. No, I don't think I'd have a problem with it at all. That's where my evil lair is. It would be a nice patch of countryside. Yes, it would. I have an undiagnosed auditory processing disorder. I'm also an introvert. Sometimes being around people with noise can be very exhausting. It is. It's hard work. It can be very, very exhausting. And I wonder if, I mean, I was at school always in the lessons when I was actually supposed to be doing some studying, and there was an element of discipline going on. I was always I got into problems with the teachers because I was always staring out the window, imagining whatever the next fantasy story I was thinking of writing was going to be. So I wasn't a good student. So I was bullied in between the lessons, and then the teachers didn't like me very much in the lessons because I wasn't paying attention to what they were trying to teach me. So I was on a lose-lose throughout school all the way through. And even now I can be very easily distracted, and I drive my wife to absolute distraction, which does occasionally cause me some problems because the next idea for whatever it is I'm thinking about will come up in the middle of all sorts of things where I should actually be paying attention to something far more important. But your brain is off on a kind of my wife will be trying to tell me something really important about what's about to happen this week, and I'll be going, but why did dragons have one pair of wings? I mean, wouldn't it be better if they had two? You can't stop your brain from just going, but and how long should a wizard's sword actually be? and do they all wear cloaks? And what colour? All sorts of stuff like that, which is problematic. So, but we are what we are. Me distracted, I know. Surely not. Dear. So it's quite. But you are what you are. You kind of have to roll with it, don't you? We're not perfect, none of us. Dear. There we go. I once missed several classes sitting on a stair check. I've got into trouble for reading a book that I just hadn't realised the passage of time. It's just one of those things. Anyway, there we go. What have we learnt from all this? We have learnt that school is pretty rubbish. However, to be fair, not necessarily to school, but certainly to some of the teachers I had. The English, we call them masters. That shows how old I am. When I was at school, my English master, as he would have liked to have been referred to, he was the one person who actually recognised it, probably the only person for many, many years who recognised I had a talent for writing, and he spotted it almost straight away when I entered this English class for O-levels, as they were in those days. Because I remember being absolutely rubbish at English as an academic subject up until that I started in that class, and I remember the first assignment I got back, which was an essay we had to write, and I got an A, and it's like I looked at it and went, what? I've never got an A. This isn't my mark. And he, to be fair, he died a couple of years ago, sadly, but he recognised I had a storytelling thing. Okay, and he did his best to encourage it. I mean, he would lend me books and say, you should read this and you should read that, and that's how I got into Tolkien. That's how I got into Jules Verne, all those things, because of my English teacher. So whilst school was problematic, the teachers actually, in many cases, did try hard, despite the failings of the system. So I do owe them that. Which is good. So anyway, so school was bad. Teachers are good. Tolkien has made a massive impact on the fantasy genre, which is hard to avoid. And when so if you do want to write something, have a think about what you're trying to do in the fantasy realm. So there we go. We've learned that bullies need to be pushed into enormous mincer while you slowly turn the wheel. Cruel but fair, I think. Yeah. And bullies suck. Yeah. What's a pin badge? This is a sort of Celtic symbol, isn't it? I don't know. It's not Celtic, Celtic. Interwoven-y things. I'll have to go and look it up. I'm not quite sure what it was. Glenn says, my poor wife. Yes, my very poor wife. She suffers a lot having to put up with me. That's absolutely the truth. But there we go. Was that in my vows? I don't know. Dear. So never mind. Anyway, my friends, it's time to call this to a hope. So anyway, I hope that was sort of vaguely useful in some fashion to some of you. But anyway, lovely to chat about how bad things used to be. But we are products of our experiences, and we should embrace who we are. We shouldn't be ashamed of the things that have happened to us. I think it has made us the people we are today. And if we can embrace that for creative purposes, then why not? Let's embrace who we are, and use it to write all the better with. That's the way to look at it. Anyway, my friends, I must go. It's 10 o'clock. This has been a long one, but anyway, so back on Thursday, of course, for more Elite Dangerous storytelling. Back on Saturday for I'm hoping it's going to be the end of my Frontier Elite 2 stream, and then we can move on to another retro game. But we'll see. The game wasn't giving me any, wasn't helping me at all last week, so we'll see how it goes. But anyway, take care, my friends, and look after yourselves. You know, if you've survived all of those experiences that we've been talking about this evening, you've done well. You're in a good place. You're a survivor. You know, so be proud of what you've achieved. The fact that we escaped from those years. There we go. Just chatting into tangents of wisdom. There we go. Very therapeutic. That was brilliant, excellent stuff. So I'm glad it was helpful. But anyway, you guys take absolute care of yourself. Have a fantastic week. With my fondest thoughts, okay, for your future endeavours and your past selves. So take care. Obviously, speak to you again soon. Be cheerful and have a good time. Okay. Take care, my friends, and I will see you soon. Bye bye now.